Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney, and I am here from Homebase. And Homebase is a platform that helps link your university and students and scholars together to get everyone all the information that they need in a very thorough way. And so, if your school uses Homebase, we're very happy to help them with all the information they're getting over to you and answer any questions you might have about using our platform. Today, we're here for students and scholars to talk a little bit about some of the changes with duration of status. And we're joined by Travis Feuerbacher, who is an attorney, immigration attorney here in the US. And he's going to give some really basic information about duration of status and what the impact might be for you. But also, we want to keep going back to a reminder that you always want to go back to your international office as your source of final information. And so, Travis is going to be saying that over and over again. Um, but this will give you a good idea of some of the basic things that you should know about the duration of status changes and some of the things beyond duration of status itself that will be changing for you as well. If you have any questions, I will be collecting those questions in the chat throughout the presentation. So please feel free to put those in the chat. And we also have some of the questions that you pre-submitted as well. So we will be asking those to Travis at the end. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, Travis, so that you can tell us a little bit about how duration of status is going to be changing things here for students and scholars.
Thank you very much, Courtney. And thanks everybody for joining. I know that this is probably something that is causing some stress in your lives. And I want to be the first to tell you that this is not the end of the world. It is not going to dramatically affect your educational journey in the United States. It is quite simply a change in the kind of bureaucratic requirements, the framework that will kind of guide your journey. There may be a couple of additional steps you have to take along the way. But as Courtney mentioned, working closely with your school is absolutely necessary. They will help make sure that you're doing everything correctly. And if you still have any questions, immigration attorneys like me are a great source of guidance as well. So, sorry, I hit the mute button. So, quick introduction. Courtney mentioned that I'm an immigration lawyer. Before I started practicing immigration law, I was a career diplomat with the Foreign Ministry of the United States, what we call the US State Department. And during most of that career, I worked as a visa officer overseas, conducting tens of thousands of visa interviews with applicants from all over the world. Now, many of those applicants were students and scholars hoping to come to the United States. And I have now focused my immigration practice on helping applicants navigate through the application and interview process. So today, I want to focus mainly on these new rule changes that are changing what we call duration of status. So I'm going to first tell you what duration of status even is. It's kind of complicated. I'll identify some upcoming changes, and then I'm going to tell you how that will likely affect you, if at all, and how you can make sure that you're doing everything right. And you'll hear me, as Courtney said, you'll hear me say many times during this presentation that it is critical to stay in touch with your international student office at your school or your institution. They are going to be the greatest source, at least for initial guidance, as you try to sort through all of this. But I should also mention there are many representatives from schools here with us today as well. And that's really because this rule is brand new. It hasn't even come into effect yet. And so you'll also hear me say multiple times, I don't yet know exactly how this will play out. We don't yet have any proof of anybody who has gone through this system because nobody has yet. So this is really just kind of an introduction to what we expect. And I assume that with Homebase, we will probably be hosting a few more webinars on this topic as we get some more data points that we can work with. So before I jump into this, I should note that this is not meant to be legal advice. Yes, I'm an immigration attorney, but this is really just an introduction to this new set of rules. If you would like any specific guidance or if you have specific questions, please consult a qualified immigration attorney. Do not leave this to chance. I'd be happy if you reach out to me, but honestly, I'm happy if you just reach out to somebody who's qualified to give you some good guidance. So let's start here under or with a brief introduction to duration of status. This is a concept that was introduced a long time ago. For F-1 student visas, it was introduced in the late 1970s. And then in the 1980s, it was expanded to J-1 visas. So this has been with us a long time. And what it essentially means is that students and scholars are able to come to the United States, and then they have flexibility to stay in the country as long as they're doing everything correctly, what we would call maintaining status. So, using an F-1 student as an example, let's assume that your visa is approved, and hopefully everybody will be approved at their interview. You will then go to the United States, attend class, and ultimately graduate or complete your program. After you graduate, you might decide to pursue some post-completion or post-graduation OPT to get some real-world experience. You may even go on for another 2 years of STEM OPT. And then you might decide to continue your education. You might pursue a second degree at the same level, or maybe a PhD or a master's degree next. And again, as long as you're doing everything correctly and you're maintaining your status, you don't actually have to leave the United States, and you don't need to really take any additional action to ensure that you can stay in the country. And I should also mention that if you have a visa and your visa expires, it actually doesn't affect how long you can remain. Again, as long as you're doing everything correctly, you can stay in the United States. And many students do exactly that. Well, this is all changing with this concept in this new rule where we're seeing an end of this flexible admission period that we call duration of status. So now, after your F-1 visa is issued and you come to the United States, you will be admitted for a finite period of time, up to 4 years maximum, which means that you actually can't stay in the United States even if you're doing everything correctly. If you want to do anything beyond the time that you're admitted, you have to take some additional steps, which we'll talk about. So if you're embarking on a 4-year degree program, after you graduate, you'll have to either leave or do something, which I'll explain, before you can go on to maybe another degree program or OPT or anything else. Now, this is going to be especially important if you are embarking upon a degree program that will take more than 4 years to complete. So, for example, if you're pursuing a PhD that will take 5 or 6 years, you will need to plan to take some additional steps before you graduate, because otherwise you will only have 4 years to be in the United States. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is not something that you should be alarmed about. It is really just a couple of additional formalities that you have to go through, and your school is going to be in a great position to help guide you through the process. So let's talk about what the rule actually says. And I'm not going to go through all of the new changes. I'm just going to introduce a couple of the key changes here. Sarah, I think, has a link to the new actual rule, which we can put in the chat window here. I don't expect all of you to read this. It's extremely long. But if you have any questions, and maybe if you're interested, that is also a place that you can start. So the new rule, as of today, it is set to take effect on September 15th, 2026. So just a couple of weeks from now. At that time, you will be admitted to the United States for up to 4 years, and that will be limited by the duration of your program and a couple of other factors. It may also be limited by your validity period of your passport. So, for example, if you're going to a 4-year bachelor's degree program, but your passport expires in 2 years, you will probably only be granted 2 years to remain in the United States. And then you'll have to take some additional steps. And I'll tell you in a moment how you can track this kind of time period. Another key change for F-1 visa holders is that you will no longer have a 60-day grace period after you graduate. It has now been shortened to 30 days, which is the same grace period that J-1 exchange visitors have. If you find that you need more time, you will either need to file an application with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, or you will need to leave the United States and re-enter. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. There's a new restriction on what they call lateral or reverse matriculation. And this may affect some of you actually, so it's actually very important. What this means is if you complete a program after September 15th, 2026, you cannot go back to the same level of degree. So if you complete a master's degree, you cannot start a new master's degree. You can also not go backwards. So if you complete a master's degree, you cannot then begin a bachelor's degree. The rule essentially requires that you move forward to the next level up. So if you have completed a master's degree, your only option to continue your education would then be a PhD. So that is a new restriction if you complete a program after September 15th. If you're pursuing English training, you will not be able to qualify for more than 24 months of English training. And then finally, the rule talks about limitations on changing what is called educational objectives. So let me talk about that for a moment. If you are an undergraduate student, so you're pursuing a bachelor's degree or anything below that, maybe a high school student, you are essentially going to be locked in place for the first year of that program. You cannot change your major. You cannot change any sort of your educational level. You can also not transfer schools unless there is what they call an extenuating circumstance, which I'll talk about in a moment. So again, if you're a bachelor's degree student, you're basically locked into that program for the first year. If you're a graduate student, you're essentially locked into your program for the entirety of your program. You can't change your major. You cannot change your educational level. And then you can only transfer schools if there is what they call extenuating circumstances. So what are these extenuating circumstances? Well, the rule makes it very clear that these are highly limited situations which are completely beyond your control as a student or an exchange scholar. So examples are your school is destroyed in a natural disaster. It closes permanently. Your program is eliminated. The school loses its ability to even admit international students. This rarely, if ever, happens. And so again, if you are a bachelor's degree student, assume that you are locked in place for the first year. If you're a graduate student, assume that you are essentially locked in place for the whole entirety of your program, and you probably should not be planning to change your degree or your educational level or transfer. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that you should be tracking how long you have to remain in the United States. And you will do that through an official document called the I-94. We also have a link that we can share. It's on the slide here as well, where you can go online and download a copy of the I-94 form, which looks like this. This is an automatically generated form that will be generated every time you enter the United States. And so if you enter the United States before September 15th as an F or a J visa holder, you will see where I have it outlined in red, it will say admit until date and then D/S. That means that currently you've been admitted under this concept of duration of status. You don't have a fixed expiration date by which you have to either leave or take some other, action. Now, if you enter on or after September 15th, and even if you're already in the United States on September 15th, your I-94 will look different. I'm showing an example here for a visitor visa holder, a B2 holder, but you can see where it says admit until date, and it has a specific date, 22nd of May, 2025. That is essentially the deadline that you either have to leave the country or take some other action, like apply for more time. And so this is what your I-94 will look like on September 15th, if you're already in the country, or it's what it will look like if you enter the country on or after September 15th. So before you do anything else, please bookmark this website and plan to download this form every time you enter the country. And I would track this deadline. This is a very important date, And remember, I said it might be limited if your passport has less than 4 years of validity on it. So you may be surprised to see that you're only admitted for another year and a half, even though you're embarking on a 4-year program. So please download this form. Please note this date and plan ahead, again, working with your school to make sure you know what you need to do before your time expires. Now, you might need more time in a number of circumstances. I think it's easy to think about a situation where you're embarking on a program that's going to take you more than 4 years to complete. That could be a PhD program, as an example. It's a 5, 6, maybe even a 7-year program, but you're only going to be admitted to the United States for 4 years initially. If you plan to pursue OPT or STEM OPT after you graduate, you will need more time because when you're initially admitted to the United States, your authorization, your admit and tell date will not cover OPT or STEM OPT, at least initially. If you graduate and you want to move to the next level of study, like you finish a bachelor's degree and now you want to pursue a master's degree, you will need more time. Similarly, if you complete an English program and now you want to move to a bachelor's degree program or a master's degree program or whatever it is, you will likely need more time then. So if you need more time, and again, watch that admit and tell date and plan ahead. And if you find that you will need more time, you essentially have two options. First, you will need to obtain a new I-20 form if you're an F-1 visa holder, or a DS 2019 form if you're a J-1 visa holder. And that form will show how much more time the school or your institution has essentially determined that you need or that is warranted in your situation. With that new form, then you have two options. First, you can file an application with USCIS called the I-539 Extension of Status application, which essentially says, hey, US government, I need more time to, finish my degree or pursue OPT or whatever it is. Or option two is to leave the United States and then re-enter the country with a valid visa, of course, and with that new I-20 or DS 2019 form. Now, this is a bit of an open question. Number one, we don't yet know how USCIS will handle these extension of status applications. We haven't really needed them yet for students. And so we're going to be watching this. Similarly, we don't yet know how the customs officials, Customs and Border Protection, will treat students and exchange visitors when they leave and re-enter the United States requesting more time. I don't anticipate that this will be any sort of disaster, but again, we don't have any evidence or proof of how it's being done yet. So this is something that we will be monitoring before we can, offer any specific guidance. The rule does say, though, when you might be able to qualify for more time. And I would assume that this will apply whether you're submitting that application inside the United States or if you're presenting yourself to a customs official after you've left the country and you're coming back. So first of all, you need to make sure that you meet some basic criteria. You need to make sure that you're maintaining your F or J status. In other words, you're doing nothing wrong. You're not violating your visa. You're attending a full course load. And of course, you need a new I-20 or DS 2019 form that confirms that, you need more time. And you have to make an argument, what's called an acceptable basis to request more time. Well, what is an acceptable reason for requesting more time? Generally speaking, it's situations that are outside of your control. It could be that you're pursuing a program that's just going to take more than 4 years, like a PhD. It could be some what are called compelling academic reasons, like, delays in obtaining research funding or a change in your research advisor. Or maybe you've changed your undergraduate major again after that first year when you're allowed to do so. Could be a documented illness or medical condition. And then there's kind of a general catch-all acknowledgement that other circumstances that are outside of your control may warrant additional time. The rule says there are also circumstances where you are generally not going to be able to qualify for more time. And these are generally situations that are completely within your control. So you're repeatedly failing courses, or you're on academic probation or suspension, or you're just not completing your work. You're not going to class, you've got incompletes showing up on your transcripts. If that's the situation, and you don't have some, legitimate reason like a documented illness or medical condition, it may be virtually impossible to get more time, whether you apply for more time in the United States or whether you leave the country and try to come back. So this has always been the case, though. It's always important that you make sure you don't violate the terms of your visa. You go to class, generally pass your courses. There's never been and there will not be a requirement that you make perfect grades, but you do need to demonstrate that you're generally moving forward and you're prioritizing your school. You're taking this seriously. And if you're doing that, I am still confident that you will be able to qualify for more time if you need it. Now, I do want to talk about OPT and STEM OPT briefly. I know that there were several questions raised when you signed up for this webinar about it. If you want to pursue OPT or STEM OPT after you graduate, you will need to now file 2 applications. So as it is now, you have to apply for an employment authorization. And once that's granted, you can start working and you're good. Well, in the future, you will also need to apply for more time because, again, you will be admitted through the end of your educational program. If you're granted the ability to pursue OPT or STEM OPT, you will get a new I-20 form. Then you will need to request more time in order to stay in the United States and actually participate in that program. Now, there are a couple of open questions here. The rule specifically says it does not change anything about OPT or STEM OPT. The application processes, the timelines, everything is going to be the same, but the rule also says you should file an application to extend your status as early as you can. And that's likely because USCIS will have some backlog. They're going to be inundated, we expect, with these types of applications. So this is where I would, again, recommend that you work with your school to understand when it's best, when it's most advantageous to be submitting these applications. And note that your school is not likely going to do this for you. Schools are very concerned about, going too far and maybe even engaging in the unauthorized practice of law or, bringing unnecessary liability to their institution. So they should be able to give you some general guidance about what the law advises you to do. But if you need support in completing these applications, or you have, specific questions about your situation, you also may want to consider reaching out to an immigration lawyer who can make sure you're doing everything right. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the concept of a transition period, which is mentioned in the rule. And I want to be very clear here. Generally speaking, it doesn't actually matter much if you're in the United States before September 15th, when the rule goes into effect, or if you enter the country after that date or on that date. You're essentially going to be treated the same because on September 15th, we anticipate, based on what the rule says, that everybody will have an I-94 that has a firm, specific admit and tell date on it. So if you're already in the United States before the 15th, your form will likely change from DS, duration of status, to a specific admit and tell date, which is no later than 4 years from that date, plus a 30-day grace period. A 60-day grace period. And that is basically the biggest difference. You retain a longer post-graduation grace period than you would if you enter after September 15th. That's really the biggest distinction. So a lot of students have reached out to me saying, should I travel? Should I make sure I'm in the United States before September 15th? And my response is, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, you will have a slightly longer grace period after you graduate or after you complete your OPT. But other than that, you're still going to have a specific admit until date, just like you would if you enter after the rule takes effect. Again, if you enter after the rule takes effect, your grace period will be limited to 30 days if you're an F-1 visa holder. The other distinction, and I'm aware that this probably won't affect many of you, but if you are filing for OPT or STEM OPT before March 18th, 2027, you do not need to file an extension of status application if you're already in the United States before September 15th, and if you don't leave before you file this application. There's a lot of ifs there. But essentially, if you're in the United States before the rule takes effect, you don't leave, you don't file any sort of extension of status application or do anything else, you only need to file your employment authorization, and you don't need to file an extension of status application for OPT. If you leave the United States and come back after the 15th, or if you file an application to extend status, you will be treated like everybody else. You will have the limited 30-day grace period. And if and when you apply for OPT, you will also need to apply for an extension of status. So again, there's a little bit of kind of, benefit, I guess, if you want to call it that, of coming to the United States before the rule takes effect. But in my humble opinion, it's not a big enough difference to change your travel plans or to, panic and make sure you're back in the country before the rule takes effect, because by and large, everybody will be treated the same under the new rule. So that's really what I wanted to cover. Again, this is a really basic introduction. I want to make sure we have time for question and answer. And like I said, we're going to be continuing to offer more guidance as we, have some experience with the new rule. But before I open it up, I do want to mention very quickly that in the Homebase platform, if you have access to the platform already, and if you don't, you should gain access to it, we do have lots of guidance and tools to help you prepare for the visa application and interview. First of all, my partner Mandy and I have created some sort of mini courses that we have in the program, which are free, available to you for free, where we talk about the step-by-step process to obtain an F-1 visa. We talk about the DS-160 form. We talk about how visa officers consider different factors when they make their decision. And we talk about the student visa interview specifically. If you want more help, there's also links to a very comprehensive set of online courses that we've completed, which are available online, which guide you through every step of the journey. We even include topics like how to address previous refusals, what to do if you have family in the United States or a pending immigrant visa, and all the other things that may generate concerns during your interview. And if you have specific questions, again, please reach out to an immigration attorney. If you want to reach out to us, we can help you evaluate different options. Maybe the student visa isn't right for you, or maybe you have something else to think about. We can conduct practice mock interviews. We can help you with multiple previous denials, administrative processing delays, and other complications. So again, don't leave this to chance. Please reach out to somebody who knows what they're talking about. And if you reach out to us, we'll do our best to help. So, Courtney, let's turn it over. I think we have about half an hour left, and I know we have lots of questions.
There are a lot of questions that have come in, and we have a lot of questions that continue to come in about, um, well, travel is a big topic, but I think something else that might be really helpful to clarify is just what does every document that a student has mean, and how does the date on that document impact what is going to be the end of their admit until date? So some questions came up very specifically about what if my passport ends before my I-20 or my visa? Another one was how long can I stay in the US if my visa is expiring while I'm here and I'm supposed to study longer. And so I think if we could maybe just kind of go back to what are the basics that people really need to know about their immigration documents and what dates should they be looking at on those could be a great place to start.
It's a great question, and this is super confusing if you're just kind of starting to think about it. So I like to think of the visa, whether it's an F or a J visa, really is just your ticket that lets you enter the United States. Beyond that, it really doesn't mean anything. So as long as that ticket is unexpired or until that ticket, that visa expires, you can theoretically or potentially use it to enter the United States, assuming that you are, you have a valid I-20 and, you're really going to be a student. If you're in the United States and that visa expires, it actually doesn't mean anything at all, except if you leave the country, you will need to renew that visa before you can come back. So there are a lot of dates that are going to be kind of meaningful in your journey, and I'll try to go through them. So, uh, talking about F-1 visa holders, you will have an I-20 form from your school. That I-20 form will have a program start date and a program end date. Both of those dates are important. The program start date is a deadline by which you must be in the United States at your school ready to begin. Your visa officer during your interview will look at that program start date, and if they're not convinced that you can travel to the country before that date, they will likely deny your visa. So make sure you schedule your appointment early and you leave yourself enough time to travel before the program start date. Now, when you enter the United States after September 15th, your admit until date, or kind of the duration that you're allowed to be in the United States, is not going to be dictated by when your visa expires. It will be dictated by your program end date on your I-20 form. So you will be granted up to 4 years plus a 30-day grace period, but that will be limited by the program end date. So an example, let's say that you're about to embark upon a 2-year master's degree program and you enter after September 15th. Well, you will be admitted to the United States for up to 2 years plus a 30-day grace period. Now, I want you to keep track of your visa expiration date because if you plan to leave the United States and return, if your visa has expired, you will need to make arrangements to renew that visa. I also want you to keep track of that admit until date because you cannot stay beyond that date or you will now be potentially accruing unlawful presence and all sorts of other complications may result. The last thing I want you to be paying attention to is the expiration date of your passport. Because, like I said, we don't know this for sure, but it's very likely that your admit until date will be limited. It's already going to be limited by the duration of your program plus that grace period, but it may be limited even further if your passport is expiring before your program concludes. We see this with H-1B visa holders as an example. You may normally be admitted to the United States for 3 years at a time, but the next time you come, your passport expires in 6 months. You're likely only going to be admitted for 6 months. A lot of people miss that detail. They end up staying longer than they were allowed to, and that leads to a lot of complications. So yes, there are a lot of dates to track. And I actually know that a lot of schools are thinking about ways that they can help you keep track of those dates. And Courtney, I think Homebase is even thinking about some options as well, right?
Yeah, so we're working with what schools need, but ultimately, I think the best resource for some of these questions is going back to your school and talking to them. Making sure you read your emails on a regular basis as well is something that I know I worked with students for almost 20 years, and it's hard when we're trying to reach out to you and get information to you or ask questions, and you may not look and respond to your emails. So much more important than it ever was just to read those emails and stay on top of them. One other thing we are doing is we do have a calculator, and some of your schools probably have already utilized this, but it will help you to determine your admit until date until you actually have one on your I-94. So people who don't travel, we anticipate that they'll continue to have D/S on their I-94. And so you'll have to find the end of your stay on your own. And so we have a calculator to help you calculate that. And then also you'll want to go back to your office as well. Travis, a lot of questions came in about that. So that was actually my next question for you too, was for students who don't travel and they have that D/S, what should they expect over the next couple of years?
So on September 15th or shortly thereafter, you should expect that your I-94 will show a firm admit until date. So, from what the rule says, nobody will retain this flexible duration of status admission, framework after September 15th. So if you're already in the country, you don't travel, you're still going to have a deadline. And again, I want you to track that deadline so that you can take appropriate steps before your authorization expires.
Okay, so again, we just going back to what Travis had talked about previously is the documents that you have are the indicators of how long you have to stay in the country. And so it's really important to look at and understand all of those documents. Um, Another question that has come up a lot. So it seems like we have a lot of students here today that are on OPT or maybe on STEM and have some concerns about traveling in the future. So let's say you do have a valid visa and you do have a current job and you do have documentations of the job. What should they take into consideration when they're thinking about traveling? Does this prevent them from traveling altogether?
No, honestly, I don't think that this really changes anything in that situation. OPT, STEM OPT are programs that I'm a huge fan of. I think that they're a great way to build kind of real world experience, boost your resume, maybe even put you in line for an H-1B. I think it's fantastic. If you travel after you graduate, number one, make sure that you still have a valid student visa. If you need to renew your student visa, it can be a little bit more difficult to do so after you've already graduated. Visa officers are looking at you, somebody standing in front of them at the interview window, seeking a student visa, and their mind is thinking, okay, this is a student. This is somebody who's in class. If you've already completed your program and now you're actually coming back to the United States essentially to work, it can be difficult for some officers to issue a student visa in that situation. And they may, and I see this a lot, they say, look, I can't approve a student visa. You should think about a work visa. That's not really what I would say the right decision would be, but that can be a complication. If your visa is still valid, then this is not something I would generally have a lot of concern about. Assuming that you have, a firm offer for an OPT or a STEM OPT position, and you can document that, then I think, all other things considered, international travel's okay. Now, I should say here, there are 20, maybe 25 different considerations that I typically will go through with a client when they say, Travis, can I travel without any sort of risk? There is always a risk when you leave the country and you plan to come back. And I think that this is a very personal decision that you should make. And if you really are interested in understanding the risk and how, big or small that risk is, that's where you really should reach out to an immigration lawyer to truly understand how to make the right decision.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize that enough too, that every single situation for each person is quite unique. And so to be able to say, yes, it's okay, or no, it's not okay, is very dependent on a lot more of the specifics to that situation. So if you are considering travel, it is always a great idea and advisable situation to go talk to your international office. They may or may not be able to assist you in this, especially when it comes to sort of risk assessment. And so that's where working with an immigration attorney as well is often a good idea too, to just assess what is the likelihood of being able to return after travel? So, sometimes there's very low risk situation, all of the ducks are in a row, very easy to say, yeah, this is a pretty good situation unless something unexpected comes up versus a little bit more difficult to maybe get back in. So, always advisable to very specifically go into your situation with someone one-on-one. I have a sort of a unique situation here, but it seems like actually a couple of people might be in this situation, Travis. And so want to bring up, um, if you are in the United States and you are in F-1 status because you did a change of status within the United States to become an F-1 student, and your I-94 is on your approval document, this person, even more specifically, may be from a country where there's no visa appointments open and available at the moment. What do you recommend to them? Is this going to affect them differently than it would anyone who applied for a visa abroad and re-enter or they entered the US?
Yeah, this is a really nuanced situation. I'll tell you, generally speaking, visa officers do not like changing status. And it's funny because changing status inside the United States is perfectly legal. There's a formal process that you go through with USCIS to do so. But the next time you find yourself outside of the country, you will need to apply for a new visa before you can come back. And that's where a visa officer will likely look at the situation and start wondering, why didn't you get a visa before you started your educational program? Was there a reason that you didn't leave the United States? Is this a sign that you maybe don't plan to leave in the future? Or are you trying to hide something from the visa officer? There's all sorts of questions, fair or unfair, that can lead to some additional scrutiny. So I understand, look, changing status can be much more convenient. It may be the only option you have if you're from a country where you just can't schedule a visa interview. India is a good example of that right now. But it does pose a potential for complications in the future. And that's where, assuming you're using an immigration lawyer to help you change your status, I would ask them about, the pros and cons of doing so that you really understand kind of what this might mean for your future.
Another question is about so there's currently a lawsuit in place. So does this mean that this rule at this moment is not finalized and not moving forward, or is this rule still moving forward as of today?
We have to assume as of today, the rule is still moving forward and it will still be effective on September 15th. There is a fairly massive lawsuit that was filed I think it was about 2 weeks ago now. It was joined in by several major institutions, including NAFSA, which we're all part of. It's an organization of international educators. It was joined by one of the largest labor unions in the country, the United Auto Workers Union. And so it will be interesting to see how that progresses through the court system. But until and unless a court actually says this cannot go forward, it is still going forward. So I'm telling everybody, just assume that this will take effect on September 15th unless we hear otherwise.
Okay, that is a great way to look at it. So for now, we are assuming that things are going to move forward. But of course, we'll continue to keep an eye on the news for that. Um, so another question, just generally speaking, are there any changes to travel and reentry for students under this new rule? So when they're preparing to leave the US and reenter, is there any additional considerations that they should take when they're preparing their documents, and what should they have with them?
It's a good question. And the short answer is we don't completely know yet because, like I said, the rule's not effective yet. We don't know how, customs officials will treat students when they're returning. Here's my assumption. We all know what assuming does to you and me, but here's my assumption. If you are a student and you don't need additional time, let's say you've been admitted through August of 2028, you leave over a long weekend and you come back, everything else is the same. I don't actually anticipate that the situation will be any different after September 15th. My advice to this type of student is always generally, be prepared to explain where you're going to school, when you plan to graduate. If you already have any sort of transcripts or other grades, bring a copy of those with you to show that you're attending class. Make sure you have a valid passport, F-1 visa, I-20 form. It's really the same as it's always been. If you leave the United States and you need more time to complete your program or proceed to OPT or whatever the situation is, that's where the unknown really comes in. My assumption again is that the customs official will evaluate you just like a visa officer would. Why do you need more time? How can you justify that? And that's where preparation will be, I think, important to make sure you're able to explain the situation. But this is something that we're largely waiting until after September 15th to see how it plays out. And I don't have a specific answer yet, unfortunately.
Okay, so I kind of love this next question. So, whoever you are that asked this, it's a great question. When is the right time to start thinking about processing and applying for an extension? And the reason I like this is because you're already thinking ahead, which is great. It prevents everyone from having to scramble at the last minute and maybe put together documents that are not as good as they could have been if you started early. So, Travis, what's the right time to start thinking about an extension?
I agree. This is a great sign that you're already thinking about it. And the rule actually says there's kind of a preamble or an introduction in the rule that specifically says you should start planning ahead as early as you can. If you already know you will need more time, don't procrastinate. Don't leave it till the last minute. They actually say that it's advisable to apply maybe 6 months or more before your admit until date expires. And that to me is an indication that they're anticipating pretty extensive backlogs, and it may take months and months for these applications to be approved. So, yeah, I think you should be thinking about it early. Uh, I don't yet have kind of a magic formula because, again, we're not in the situation yet. But this is where I would again remind you to stay close to your school and see what kind of advice they have for you.
Yeah, and someone also asked us, do DSOs and AROs still process my extension? And the answer to that is a yes, they do part of the extension process still. So going back to your international office to discuss extensions is still a very important and mandatory step of being able to extend your I-20 or your DS 2019. And something else I would say on that too is if you already know you need an extension on your program, go and talk to your office now. Go see what you need to do to get that extension. So, as Travis was just saying, plan ahead, think early, think about what you're doing. So, he did mention at the beginning, not a lot has changed in reality in your day to day, but you do need to be aware of all your dates and what your documents currently say, and think about how long you're going to need to study in total. Um, okay, so another question for you here is, this one came up quite a few times, and I'm just going to recognize I know we don't really have an answer to this one yet, but I want to put it out there so we can talk about it a little bit. If you're a PhD student and you're thinking about going with a master's degree instead of a PhD, what do we think about this? What should you do today?
Yeah, this is another bit of an open-ended question. So, again, under the new regulations, if you're a graduate student, you're essentially locked in place for the entirety of your program. So, under a strict reading of the rule, I'm not actually sure that you would be able to change from a PhD to a master's degree. Uh, Maybe there will be an exception made, but it doesn't seem like there will be, at least very often. So if you're already thinking about that, you might actually want to try to make that change before September 15th, while you're sure you can. Because again, after September 15th, it may not be possible.
Great. Yeah. So for those of you that are here today and thinking about things right now is a really good time to pose these questions to your office and start thinking about what are your goals. If you're thinking about a master's degree instead of a PhD, now's a great time to discuss it before September 15th.
And
Uh,
for what it's worth, Courtney, I was working with a student just last week who decided after a couple weeks at a master's degree program, it was not the right fit. and they decided to transfer, and they knew that after September 15th, that wouldn't be possible. So they did it, perhaps earlier than they otherwise would have. They
Mhm.
got their records transferred. I think this week they started at the new school. Everything is great. So yeah, it is something that I would consider.
Great. And I just have a good example here, and I just want to read it because I think it makes an example of what we're talking about with document dates. So, an example of what might my program end date be here? What is my admit until date? So, if I have an end date in May 2028 and my visa is expiring in July 2028, what would you anticipate my admit until date be? What is the last day I could likely be in the US without filing any extra paperwork?
It would likely be May 2028 plus a 30-day grace period. It
Yeah.
is not anticipated to be limited by your visa expiration date. And I am actually, give me just a moment. I'm going to share a sample I-20 form here, which is from WashU. I'm going to apparently be an MBA candidate. I'm from China and I'm going to WashU, if anybody was wondering. And my date of birth was a generous 2001. So I'm actually very young. In this I-20 form, my program ends on December 22nd, 2027. And by the way, this is obviously a sample form. This is not a real form, if anybody was wondering. But my program ends on December 22nd, 2027. With this end date, my anticipation would be that my admit until date would be December 22nd, 2027, plus a 30-day grace period, which I'm terrible at math. That probably comes out to around January 20th or 21st, 2028. Now, if my visa expires in, let's say, November 2027, that does not and should not, at least, affect my admit until date. But if I plan to, go home for Thanksgiving holiday in November and my visa has already expired, I will need to plan to renew the visa before I can come back to the United States. So yeah, there's a lot of dates to think about here. This, by the way, I mentioned earlier, the program start date. This is the deadline by which I must be in the United States. And so if I have my visa interview on August 14th, my officer is going to look at that and say, there's no way, even if I approve this, that you can be in the United States today. And that can lead to a denial. And so after you're in the United States, this is the date, the program end date, that is likely to be kind of the limiting factor that determines how long you can stay in the country.
Perfect. Yeah, so that's what I really just wanted to reinforce there is your visa is your entry document, as Travis said before. But you still have to know what it says because if you're planning on traveling abroad, it might expire and you'll need to renew it while you're abroad. So one thought or one thing to consider is putting calendar reminders into your calendar that are going to pop up 6 months or 3 months before your documents expire so that you know what those are and they are on your radar. Don't leave it to fate. I know for myself, time goes by quickly and it creeps up. And so a reminder will go, oh, that is already in 6 months. I need to get that taken care of. Um, Another question, this is a little easier one. Are there any 60-day grace periods left once this rule goes into effect? And this is actually not the easiest question to answer, unfortunately.
It's not. Let me try to make it simple. I'll do my best. So, yes, you will keep a 60-day grace period if you're an F-1 visa holder and you're in the United States before September 15th and you don't leave after that date and come back, and you don't file an extension of status application. If all of those things are true, you will have a 60-day grace period after you graduate. But remember, if you need more time, if you're going on to another program, if you leave the United States and come back, then you'll be put into kind of the general population of everybody else. And that's when your grace period would be limited to 30 days.
Perfect. So it's not an easy question to answer. And I've actually heard some advice. If you're in doubt, go with 30 days because you're not going to be wrong with the 30 days. But when you go with the 60, you really have to be certain that you're correct. So when in doubt, just stick with your grace period is 30 days and you will not be wrong under that because it is a 30-day grace period for many people. Okay, so we're coming right up on time here. I think another question, one more that I want to get out there before, two more. One is about passport expiration. And so, you know, we've always said you want to keep your passport valid a minimum of 6 months into the future, but how might an expiring passport impact someone's admit until date?
I should say that I don't know this for sure, but my anticipation is that your admit until date might be limited by the expiration date of your passport. And so let me go back to my I-20 example here. Again, in this example, my program ends on December 22nd, 2027, which means that my admit until date is anticipated to be January, I don't know, 20th-ish, 2028, which would be the end date plus 30-day grace period. If my passport expires on November 1st, 2027, I would anticipate that my admit until date would be pushed up to November 1st, 2027. That's how it works with H-1B work visa holders. They may have a petition that's valid for 3 years, but if their passport expires in a year and a half, they're generally granted only a year and a half to remain in the United States. And so that's why checking your I-94 is so important. And beyond that, Courtney, Customs and Border Protection are human beings, just like the rest of us. They do make mistakes. It's rare, but they do sometimes. I have seen situations where an I-94 had an error on it for whatever reason. So if nothing else, you should be checking that I-94 document, that record, just to make sure A, that you know when your admit until date is, and B, if there is an error, you might start thinking about how you can correct that issue. And there are ways to correct various issues like that.
Oh, absolutely. And I'll say also from my own experience, there are certainly errors on I-94s. And if you find one, talk to your international office right away. They are very likely to know exactly where and how to correct the error within your state, within the port of entry that you came through. So go to your international office if you see an error. And I also can't stress enough to look at your I-94 immediately after you enter the US every single time. I think we will all be telling you this endlessly, but you have to know what your I-94 says. Okay, so just a final thing to wrap up. What are some tips that you have for students and scholars navigating this change, Travis?
The biggest tip I have is to make friends with your international student office. Depending on the school or the institution where you're going or where you are right now, this may be a one-person team. It may be an office with 25 staff members. It varies widely, but you really should take an opportunity to introduce yourself to them, be nice to them. They are inundated with, questions and concerns right now. And honestly speaking, they're trying to navigate through this and try to figure out what this all means, just like I am and just like all of you are. But they will be your first line of defense. They're in a great position to, help you move forward. So that's the biggest tip I can offer. Beyond that, I would stay active in communities like the Homebase community, like any other communities your school may have available to you. Monitor official channels. Don't rely on what you hear in a WhatsApp group or a WeChat group or a Reddit post. I would really start looking at State Department guidance and USCIS guidance and guidance from your school. I'm already seeing a pretty large amount of misinformation floating around about this. So be careful what you look at, but it is a good idea to try to stay on top of this as we proceed.
Yeah, thank you. Just to second that from the international office perspective, I'd like to say a couple tips. One is very carefully read all the communications that you get from them. They spend a lot of time putting those together and making sure that they're getting you the information that you need. So before you go in to ask questions, make sure you've read what they already have out there. And then one other thing is remember, as Travis said, be kind, be understanding, and also know that you really only need to send that single email. You don't need to send a follow-up of multiples of the same email or call. Give them a couple of days. It's very common for offices at this time of year to be very busy and have more emails that they're able to answer in a day. Look for your advising options, drop in, appointment, all of those different things. I know the offices are really, really wanting to help every single person. And so any place where you can make sure you're following their information and then seeing how they're trying to help you first is going to be very helpful for them. Okay. Thank you all so much for attending, Travis. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. We know it's a challenging time, but we all know that we're all going to get through it together. And as Travis said at the beginning, they feel big, but it's not as huge as we all sometimes are making it. So we're all going to get through this, keep our status. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck.